Welcome to part 3 of chapter 5 as we move into classical Greece in a more determined way. So we're going to start this part by looking at the Acropolis. So this is the temple complex in the heart of Athens. It is on a hill and it's walled in. I want you to notice several buildings here. You can also notice the seemingly haphazard arrangement of the buildings. So there's no central axis like we saw in Egypt, but instead a person entering through this gate would have to turn to get over here to the temple. And then there's several smaller temples around here as well. Another important thing about the Acropolis, we're going to look at several monuments here, is that this was dedicated to the patron deity of the city of Athens. And in the classroom, I usually ask my students if they know who that deity is or was, and usually somebody comes up with the answer, and the answer is in the name of Athens. So the patron deity of Athena was of Athens was Athena. And this was a temple dedicated to Athena. This is her main place of residence in the city. This celebrated her miraculous birth, coming fully formed from the forehead of her father Zeus. And so that's what Parthenos means. It means the birth of Venus. This is the Parthenon. And you can see it's also in terrible, terrible condition. And this is because the Greeks, in their very great wisdom of the 17th century, they were fighting a war in the modern period. War never ends, sadly. Used this as a warehouse for their gunpowder and their ammunitions. And it took a hit and was destroyed. So that's why all these pieces, a person didn't know that. They would just look at all the pieces of rock on the ground and say, well, why don't they just put the puzzle back together again? Well, there's a lot of damage here. And then there's a lot of man-made damage later when English archaeologists came and they discovered all this sculpture lying around. They took it off to England, where it sits in the British Museum to this day. So there's a lot of reasons why the Parthenon looks like this. This was part of the reconstruction of Athens that Pericles was in charge of in the 5th century. So I had Pericles on that timeline that I gave you. The analyses of various parts of the building show subtle curves and an entasis, meaning that the columns are not as straight as they appear. So that's kind of an interesting thing. It was tweaked in order to look really good and solid from the viewpoint of where this camera is on the ground. There you go. So let's look at this. So you can tell, again, in class, I would ask students to tell me what order this is. So I'm assuming that you've all studied these columns and you've seen this rhythm across here. And you know that word, but the word is Doric. So this is a Doric column. And you can see the empty pediment up here, and we will see some of the stuff that was in the pediment, but is very, very much damaged. We can also see the triglyph and metapee pattern. I'm going to look at some of the metapees. Triglyph just means these 3 bars, and then the space between them, which is kind of squarish space, was filled with sculptures as well. There were lots of sculptures on this building. So here's another interesting thing. There was a huge fan of Greek art in Nashville, and this person financed or pushed for this public monument in a park in Nashville that is a full-size replica of the Parthenon in Athens. And so if you ever go to Nashville, you really should go see this because it's kind of unbelievable. But everything is here. All of the Metapees sculptures are here, the pedimental sculptures, although they don't really conform with educated opinions today of how the figures would have looked. Still, it's all there. Nashville Parthenon, useful. So there's a view of the building we're going to look at, and here's the plan of the Parthenon, so you can see that it is peristyle, meaning it has columns going all around it. Inside, there's another structure with a wall in there, so it's not just an open space. And there's a cella here, and there would have been a large statue of Athena in there as well. Now we're going to look at the pediments, because the pediments are full of the sculpture, and after all, we're all about the art. So we're going to check out pediments. This is from the East Pediment, and I've put there's the two pediments shown up here, and I've put a little red rectangle around the area that this is coming from. So just like we saw at Aphia, we've seen that there's one scale more or less for the figures, although it seems like it's slightly fudged here. But the figures down in the squished parts of the triangle are also kind of squished, reclining or seated and then standing towards the middle. So you can see that. And these figures have been removed to the British Museum. I told you that also. So now let's look at the style of the figures, even though they're badly damaged. Notice the drapery over here on these three female figures, and how beautifully it's carved out of stone, clinging to their bodies, even revealing breasts and nipple there. This is called the wet drapery look, where the artist really gets into defining the body without making it nude. So uses the illusion of clinging drapery. It's all stone, of course. So that's pretty important. And from the other side of that same pediment, some more female figures reclining with clinging drapery, also in London. And one of my favorite little details, there's like an illusion of motion as the pediments, let's go back for a second, as the pediments have some figures, especially down in the squished in areas, that sometimes appear, like over here, these horses appear to be emerging from an unseen area and moving into the scene where the action is happening. So that's kind of fun, and that's very different, is that there's the dimension of time is hinted at. Now, the Metapees, and you saw there are Metapees going completely around it, and they are in these little square shapes. The themes of the Metapees on the Parthenon are the battle of the Lapiths and Centaurs. And so this is a place where I like to tell a story. I think you will figure out that I do like to tell stories in class, and since my taped lectures are the closest approximation I can come to for a real live lecture, you get my stories this way too. So the Lapiths and Centaurs. The centaur is the creature on the right that has the body of a horse and the upper torso of a man. Apparently centaurs were all male. The Lapiths were a tribe of human that lived out in the countryside of Greece somewhere. And they were going to have a wedding in their village. And there was a neighboring village of centaurs. So they decided to be neighborly and go invite the centaurs over for the wedding celebration, which is really nice, a way of accepting differences, others. So the centaurs came to the wedding, and then everybody parties, and they're having a great celebration, and a lot of wine is consumed. And the centaurs get a little bit randy, a little bit horny, and they decide they want to carry off the women from the Lapith village. And so they attempt to abduct them. But the Lapith men come to their defense and fight off the centaurs. So each of these metapees going around has a different configuration of a male Lapith fighting and conquering and defeating the centaur, the monster. But it's more than just what it seems. It also represents sort of one of the concepts of Greece, attempting to rise up from all of this animal kingdom, all of the brutality, and to be more civilized. And the Lapith and the centaur could symbolize these two aspects of a human being. The civilized rational part, represented by the Lapith, and the animal part represented by the centaur, the animal part with its urges and its appetites for food and flesh. So it is a sort of a symbolic illustration of how civilization is better than this animal existence. On the inner wall, the inner chamber of that temple, so if you go inside of the porch of all the columns around the outside, you would see the wall and a continuous frieze running around the wall of the Pan-Athenaic Procession. And so it's just a lot of figures, a lot of horses, and it represents the biggest festival in Athens, which was the Pan-Athenaic Festival, where all the residents of Athens would come up and celebrate the goddess Athena on her temple mountain. And the women of Athens would have sewn a new garment for the figure of Athena, and they would bring it up and dress her at this time. So she got a change of clothing once a year during the Pan-Athenaic Procession. So these figures, I think they're interesting more culturally and not necessarily artistically, although plenty of things have been written about them, but that's what they are. Now, also during the classical period, as I was explaining about arts, that the artists become important, the artists are gifted, and some artists take it upon themselves to raise themselves up to be more important than maybe they would have been otherwise. So this figure is created by an artist named Polyclitus, and it's called the Canon of Polyclitus because Polyclitus thought that sculpture just needed to be a little bit more controlled, a little more regimented, and he was seeing a variety of proportions, of bodily proportions. So he settled on this canon of proportions where the figure's height would be 7 times the height of his head. So he created this sculpture of the Doryphorus, or the spear bearer, using his canon of proportions. And his idea in making this figure was to make a perfect, ideal figure. So everything about him screams ideal. So he represents the classical ideal. The classical face now has lost all contact with what we saw in the archaic face, but the classical face shows no facial expression, no joy, no sorrow, no anger, because the state of perfection is this ideal of being expressionless. If he were to smile or to have any other expressionless face, he would be out of balance. He would not look perfect. Notice his musculature, his proportions, his contrapposto pose. His leg is extremely bent. His non-weight-bearing leg is in the back. So let's compare him now. We're going to look at some more details of him. Look at the details of his hand with the veins coming out on it. And there's his back. Because he's marble, he has to have a little support here to help him stand. And here we can compare him to about 100 years earlier. So this amount of progress has been made in 100 years. I told you we were going to see progress, and now I'm showing it to you. So notice the period style difference of the hair, the head, the face, The Doryphorus even has turned his head slightly, so he's not nearly as symmetrical looking as the Koros. Lots of differences going on there. Now, going back to the Acropolis, and we're going to look at the Erechtheion, which is circled over there on the left side today. So, sorry, the left side encircled. This temple was built to house an older wooden figure of Athena called Athena Polias and commemorates 3 other spots. There is an olive tree of Athena and trident marks of Poseidon, and it may date to the Mycenaean period. In other words, these focal points within this temple were extremely important throughout history. They predate the Parthenon, but the structure of the Erechtheion is new. There were 4 rooms for shrines on 2 different levels, and 3 of the sides of the building had porticos. The interior was completely destroyed. So we're going to look closer at this. I find this really interesting, mainly because of those earlier remnants. The trident marks of Poseidon are particularly interesting, I think. And here's the Erechtheion. So if I showed you this in class, I'd say, in what order is this? Because you can look at the base and you can say, ooh, it's not Doric. And look up at the top and you see these volutes. This is Ionic. So this is one of the temple fronts. You can see it's not a peristyle temple at all. It has a solid wall there. But there's also a porch over on this side. There's several porches. But the most important porch is, hold it. Oh, wait. Oh, there we go. Sorry, I don't know why that zoomed ahead of me. Is this porch, which is referred to as the maiden porch or the caryatid porch. So this is where the columns have been turned into figures of women. And there it's much imitated. But it was something that was done in the Archaic period and gets picked up here where women are supporting the roof of the porch. And if I said, what order is this? You would be stumped because it's not a column, but you'd have to look up here and see that there's no triglyph and metapiece, so that eliminates the Doric order. And then you'd have to look even closer to and look at the details of the various elements and say, oh, it's also Ionic. But anyway, there you go, the caryatid porch. Now we're going to move down and look at this tiny little temple that's stuck out on this little parapet down here, this little thing. I'll show it to you. This is the Temple of Athena Nikkei, or Athena Victor. Victory is Nikkei. And it's very, very tiny. It just has 4 columns across the front. It's stuck out like I showed you on the plan on this little parapet. So it has this beautiful view of the city of Athens down there. A single chamber, also in very bad condition. And a continuous frieze up here. It's Ionic order. One of the pieces that was in this is the relief on the right. So this little temple contains an admired relief panel with textile that clings to the goddess's body like wet silk and discreet eroticism. So here we have Athena as Victory and her wet silk garment clinging to her body, showing even like a crease where her navel is, although she was born from the head of Zeus, so I don't know. Her head is missing, sadly. And compare this to our earlier figure of the female, our Peplos Kore, from 530. So it's just a little more than 100 years. And we saw no indication of legs or body under her, but look at the Athena now. Beautiful. So late classical period has one of my favorite sculptors in it, and that's this guy, Praxiteles. So let's look. Late the 4th century, Athenian primacy ended with the Peloponnesian War in 404 BC. Eventually, Greece was conquered by Philip the Macedon, who was succeeded by his son Alexander. So the end of Greece as we know it is coming. The chaotic political environment affected the art. The classical had been calm, restrained, and ideal. In the 4th century, Greek thought and art focused more on the individual and the real world and real appearances. So Praxiteles here maintained the classical traditions of perfect beauty, but they lose a little divine dignity and assume a more human sensuality. He adopted a new canon of proportions, so he was sort of springboarding off of what Polyclitus did and came up with something newer and he thought improved. And that is the proportions of 1 to 8. So every figure should be exactly 8 times the height of his head. And exhibiting that is this sculpture of the god, sorry, Hermes with the infant Dionysus here. So you can see his style is very graceful. He's leaning into the figure of the baby. So another story is coming, and that is what's going on here. So Hermes was one of the gods, of course, and Dionysus was, or will be, the god of wine, of the grape. But this shows an imaginary scene where Dionysus is still a little baby and Hermes is teasing him. He's holding, this is a reconstruction, imagined reconstruction, where Hermes was holding up a bunch of grapes and the little baby is eagerly reaching for them instinctually, like, oh, that's grapes. I love grapes. It's a humorous piece, I think, where this adult is teasing a child and having fun. He's being playful with him. But now look at the face of Hermes over here. He still has that classical type of face that has no expression. I think if you or I were doing this and we were playing with a child in this way, we would be smiling or laughing with him, but not Hermes, because that would destroy that perfection. And this is a practically perfect face. And just to compare it to now the Canon of Polyclitus, which was the ratio of 7 to 1. Over here we have the Canon of Praxiteles, which is 8 to 1. So I think you can see a real change, a change in beauty and gracefulness of the figure that we are missing in Polyclitus in his perfection. So that is Praxiteles. So Praxiteles did some more, and in fact, the figure on the left is radical and revolutionary in what he did. This is the Aphrodite of Canidas. So Aphrodite is the goddess of love, which really means, love and sex. And the town of Canidas commissioned a sculpture of her, and Praxiteles created 2. One was nude and one was clothed, and the town chose the nude one. I don't know what happened to the clothed one, but here she is. So it's our first nude female. There's been a lot of suggestion of anatomy in the clinging drapery, but we have never seen an absolutely stark naked figure of a female. And this is her. But in Greek society, no woman would have been strutting around without clothing the way the men did, especially in their athletics. So Praxiteles gives her a reason to be nude, and that is that she was either just climbing out of the bath or she was just about to go into the bath. Because here's her clothing right here. So either she's just taken this off and she's dropping it to the floor and getting into the tub, or she's pulling it up to get dressed after a bath. So I have no idea, but that's the reason this goddess is nude. And on the right, we have another one of the practitioners of the new canon of proportions. This is Lysippos. And this is another athlete. Just notice his proportions, his elegant pose, his expressionless face. And he is scraping his arm with a strigil, which is a tool for scraping off its exfoliation. Athletes would rub their bodies with oil and then scrape it off, so it both cleans and moisturizes and exfoliates all in one. You should try it. At this point, I just showed you the Lysippos figure where the man does not have any genitals. They've been replaced by a fig leaf, and this was something that occurred to a lot of figures that were owned by the Vatican museums, that at some point in history, as tourism was increasing and people were coming to the museums to see classical artwork, somebody in charge thought that it was inappropriate for these delicate women to see men's genitals, so they were removed from sculptures and replaced with fig leaves. So that's why the poor scraper doesn't have anything. And then I've had a student ask, students have noticed that that many of the figures with genitals seem to be extremely small, on the small side, and that is because Greek artists minimized male genitalia to distinguish the civilized humans from the wild, lusty beasts. So on the left I have the Riace warrior compared with a lusty beast over here, a fawn, I think he is, some kind of an animal with a goat's head, and a very large member there. So late classical period also brings us to the period of Alexander the Great. And Lysippos, the man who brought us Hermes and the infant Dionysus, also sculpted a head of Alexander. This piece is thought to possibly be, Lysippos did not bring us Hermes. Lysippos brought us the scraper that we just looked at. Correction. He's thought to be the most authentic. Possibly Lysippos even saw Alexander and was able to sculpt him from life, or at least sketch him from life. So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence to what Alexander looked like. And one was that he had really wild hair, kind of a cowlick in front, so his hair kind of stuck up in the front. His hair was compared to a lion's mane. Lots of legends, of course, arose about Alexander the Great, but I had to show you this because we are going to talk about Alexander briefly. And here's another bronze of Alexander on horseback, showing that same sort of hairdo, that wild lion's mane, and his kind of cowlick in front. So those were tropes that artists used to depict Alexander. Now, who's Alexander? He was Philip of Macedon's son. And this was his empire, this world that he took over. So Macedonia is up here. This is where he came from. But his father had taken over Greece, and then he took over his father's rule and started spreading and conquering this insatiable appetite for land. So he had a huge empire, very similar to the territory owned by the Persians, except the Persians had not conquered Greece. But he also comes over here through Mesopotamia, through Babylon, and comes over and takes Persia and defeats Darius III, as I showed you in the ancient Near East. So that's Alexander's area. So this is the second time I've showed you this. This is a Roman mosaic, but the Roman mosaic was thought to have been copied from a Greek painting. And I should point out that we have very few Greek paintings because of loss over time. The only things that we really have a lot of are Greek vases that are painted. So anyway, this was found in a house in Pompeii, but like I said, it was believed to derive from a Greek painting. So we're going to think of it now as a Greek painting. So this showed the Battle of Issos, where Alexander over here brings his army to fight the army of Darius over here and defeats him. So let's look at some details. Here's the detail of Alexander the Great. I just want to point out his similar hairstyle again, not quite as curly, but it's there. It has his cowlick in front. The horse, I think, is just amazingly beautiful. I should point out that the medium is mosaic, meaning that the entire picture was created by placing little tiny tiles of different colors together to make this. I love this horse, but since it's not really Greek, we're not going to talk a lot about that horse. And here's Darius, the defeated Persian leader. And this is the end of part 3. So you have one more part. We're going to see what happens after the death of Alexander the Great. So be sure to hang around and to watch that part.